Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are having our first question and answer session in our ongoing tenant landlord webinar series. So the point of today is to ask questions. Ask what questions you've got regarding tenant landlord law. We have some of the most experienced tenant landlord law attorneys here on our panel today. I'll get into more of that in a minute, but I want to let folks come in and get started. But if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. There's a little Q&A box if you're not familiar with it on Zoom that you can bring up here. And so then you can please ask through that. Please do not ask through the chat because I will be putting in links and things in that way. And I will probably miss what you are asking. So please use that Q&A function. Again, it's at the bottom of your Zoom box. It should say Q&A. You may have to hit the little more uh, link, which is a circle with three dots in it. If you hit that, you should be able to see the Q&A there, if it's not inherently one of the options at the bottom of your screen. So again, we're just letting just another couple seconds here. I'm getting folks brought in. Um, all right. And yeah, please, any questions you've got, put it in the Q&A and we'll go ahead and get started. I've got a couple of housekeeping slides before I introduce our illustrious panel. Okay, and I think we are done there. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, this is our Q&A session for our webinar series, but this be the first one that you've ever attended. So what is Homeline? Homeline is a nonprofit. We help tenants in Minnesota kind of navigate what their rights are under Minnesota tenant landlord law. We also offer advocacy and organization education services. We've advised over 335,000 renters and households since 1992 when we were founded. We do offer our hotline in 4 languages. It's going to be English, Somali, Hmong, and Spanish, as well as an email option. This is our contact information here if you need to give us a call. This is especially helpful. So today, obviously, if you've got a very specific question about your specific situation, we're probably going to suggest that you call us or email us to get a more specific answer. Because everyone's situation is going to be unique to them, and we want to make sure that we give you as unique an answer as your situation calls for. Right. So this is our phone number for different language lines and how to email us. This is not an email address. This is the link to an email form that we'd use on our website. Just go to homelinemn.org and use the email and attorney link in the upper right corner. All right. So upcoming webinars. This is an ongoing series that we've had. We've started it back in 2020. And so we've been going for 5 years now almost, or coming up on the 5th anniversary, Mike. So our upcoming webinars scheduled March 19th, we'll have an overview of some common housing subsidy programs. So things like GRH and Section 8 public housing. A couple of folks from SMERLS, the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, will be joining us that day to give us that overview and share their expertise. April 23rd, then we will have someone from Housing Link, which is a nonprofit that kind of monitors more of the rental housing market, and so they're going to give us an overview of what that market looks like, kind of some of the shifts in the last year or so of what they're seeing out there. So that'll be on April 23rd. You can go ahead and register again at our website, homelinemn.org. There'll be a link to do so there. So housekeeping, this session is being recorded. You should have gotten an alert for that when you came in, but it will be posted to our website in a few days once we get it off the cloud. And then if you have questions, that's the whole point of today. So please ask your questions through the Q&A function. It should be a button located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Again, you may have to click on the little more circle with the 3 dots in it and then pull up the Q&A box there. But that brings us to our panel. right? So we have three attorneys besides myself here from Homeline who have been so gracious as to give their time to help answer your questions today. So we've got our managing attorney, Mike Farah. Let's see, next on my window is housing attorney Matt Alkenlob, and then supervising attorney Amma Carrion is here as well. So between all of them, they've got decades and decades of experience in tenant landlord law. And so honestly, questions, even if it's a question that you think it's super like that you don't know the answer to, or of course you don't know the answer, you wouldn't ask it if you didn't. But if you think it's a complicated question or a question that may not have an answer to it yet, ask away. Let's see if we can stump this panel of experts. I would like to see the fear in Amma's eyes now has given me some life. So thank you for that. But let's see if we can stump our panel of experts. I have some feeder questions as well, but I do see that we're starting to get some pulling in here.
Hey,
So
Rachel, if I could jump in.
yes,
One
please.
request when submitting a question, please identify your role in the issue that you're writing about. If you're a tenant, if you're a landlord, if you're a social worker, city inspector, a judge, whatever it might be, we it helps us to understand the context because we can't have a conversation. It's just a submitted question, and
Hmm.
that extra element helps us figure out what angle the question is coming from.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that. All right, so then. All right, we're starting to get some questions in, and so I think I'm gonna start with this an anonymous attendee who says they are a tenant, has a couple of questions around repairs, and that's a good place to start. That's a pretty common area of what are options with repairs and such, especially from the tenant's perspective. So they're asking, are there any rules or laws around timing around responding to maintenance repairs? Let's start. I'll start with Matt since you look ready and raring to go on that one.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. Repair questions, of course, the most common reason people call Homeline is to get advice about repairs. That's sort of the most common reason people call us. This is really a question of contract enforcement, and it's a really interesting question. Are there any rules around the timing? Um, Yes, there sort of are. When it comes to enforcing your rights under a contract, there's certain steps you could follow. The main way to enforce your rights to repair is to prepare to file a rent escrow action against your landlord. Um, you want to send the landlord something in writing and give the landlord 14 days to make the repairs. Um, if those repairs aren't done, then you can file this court case, this rent escrow action. You pay your rent to court instead of to the landlord, and there's a hearing in front of a judge where it's your job to show the court, here's what's broken, here's what needs fixing. The court can order the repairs, award you money back on your rent. The court can allow you to make the repairs, deduct the costs off of your rent. Um, but really, the question is sort of, what if my landlord doesn't do what they're supposed to do? Then what? And a lot of times when it comes to these contract issues, the answer is go to court. Now, that's great. The 14 days is great for sort of some everyday repairs. But here we are, February 12th, and I'm looking at the weather report, and 14 days isn't going to help us much if the heater goes out. And so for emergency repairs, there is another sort of expedited procedure called an emergency tenant remedy action. You give the landlord 24 hours notice to make the repairs, and if it's not fixed, then you file this other case. And you usually get a hearing within 3 to 4 business days, sometimes a little longer. But it's tough to get into court much faster than that.
All right. Anyone have any follow-up comments on that? I'm putting into the chat um, both the statutes regarding this information and then also Homeline's repair request form in case you have repairs that you need to submit.
Yeah, on our website, we have lots of different form letters that are available, but the repair request form is by far the most downloaded form letter on our site. As Matt mentioned, repairs is the top reason people call us. That's true every year of Homeline's existence since 1992, except 2023 when we had the eviction moratoriums that were being lifted and phased out, and it was really complicated times. So there were a lot of eviction calls that year. But yeah, repairs is the most common thing we do of all the topics.
Yep. All right. Um, so I'm going to Anonymous had other pair related questions, so I'm going to leave that question up in the Q&A, but I'm going to flip over to another one just to have a little bit of variety, the spice of life, as it were. So another anonymous attendee asks, are there any obligations for landlords to notify reasons behind police activity on the premises? So police show up at the building. Do landlords have to notify anybody about why they're there? Ama, I think you're next on my round robin cycle.
Um, Generally speaking, no. That is basically police activity. You can definitely ask the police why they're there for, but the landlord doesn't really know. I think this is what it boils down to. There are many reasons why they could be there. It could be someone called 911, etc. If, for example, there was a break-in in a garage or something like that, normally landlords would notify tenants, mostly because they have to change the codes for the garage. That's usually how you find out about that type of situation. But I'm gonna kick it back to Mike to see if he has a different opinion.
Yeah, I don't know that there is any. I mean, the question that we have, are there any obligations for landlords to notify the reasons behind police activity? So just kind of thinking a little bit deeper, what a landlord has to disclose sort of voluntarily. I think that's what this question is asking,
Mhm.
versus being asked a direct question. So um, part of me is wondering about whether or not this is asking pre-lease signing. If a applicant is shopping and they want to ask the landlord, hey, what are the police reports like here? Or something like that. I think the landlord can't lie about that, can't knowingly lie about it, but I don't know what obligation they have to disclose that information. So yeah, this is one of those things where having somebody actually submit the question, live so we could hear it would help maybe clarify what they're trying to get at. But I'm with you, Amma. I don't think there's any obligation for the landlord to disclose this. They might not know it either, like you say.
All right. So then, all right.
I was just gonna say that as tenants, it's okay to talk to the landlord. It's okay to ask for information. I think a lot of it boils down to the tone you use when you're asking for the information. And if they're a little bit dismissive, always remember you can talk to the police officers. You can look at the crime maps in your area, and it will really pop up there. Especially if you're looking for housing, and if you're a tenant there, then ask around. Tone is key here. Don't be confrontational because that makes people want to hide stuff.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So we've got, I guess I'm not actually shocked given the weather outside, but we've got a couple of different questions about poorly insulated or poorly weatherized doors and windows and such. So both Anonymous and Mary are tenants, and they're asking about, are there any laws or rules regarding outstanding repairs that affect utilities? For example, the front door is warped and extremely drafty. It is significantly affecting the heating per home energy audit. And then Mary was wondering about cabin is poorly insulated and has single pane windows. It can be 40 degrees near all the outer walls and 30 degrees in the bathroom. What recourse do I have to actually insist that the landlord actually weatherproof this place?
I think there's a lot. Those are good questions. I think there are a lot of different places to look for guidance on this. It starts with the landlord's first responsibility to keep the property fit for the use intended and in reasonable repair. Um, Windows should open and close. Doors should open and shut. A door that closes, but you can still see inches of daylight around it. That is not how doors should work. Um, so that's one place to look at it is this thing working how it should work? Is this in reasonable repair? To get a little bit more in depth about things like um, insulation and things like that, maybe what you're looking at is specific building codes from city to city. There is a lot of science and a lot of regulation that goes into insulation and R values and all this other stuff, right? The interesting thing about 504B161, that's the standard, the fit for the use intended requirement, is that it's kind of vague, right? Fit for the use intended in reasonable repair. A building code, on the other hand, much more specific. And a landlord has to follow sort of both of those things. I think the building code can certainly say what is reasonable. So that's a more complicated answer is this compliant with the building code? That you're going to contact the city. They'll have the best, you'll have the best chance from them to get an answer for whether this is compliant. Now, the question about the cabin that is 40 degrees or 30 in the bathroom, that I think we can say that is not compliant. We don't have to look at any building codes that say that. That you're going to want to think about an emergency tenant remedy action. My standard sort of next level advice is to get a thermometer that you can take from room to room and measure the heat, record the day, the time, what room you took the temperature in. So you've got a logbook saying here's what the temperature was, and then I would start with the emergency tenant remedy action.
And so folks know, I just actually posted a link to a previous webinar that actually Matt did back in October 2022,
We've done
talking
60 of
about
these.
heat.
If we've done one a month for 5 years, that's 60. I can't remember all the things.
It's more than that. We used to do them once a week, remember?
What I do remember now, yes.
But that said, yeah, Matt, you did one back in 2022 regarding heat. You kind of spelling out and did a video of, thermometers and how to take temperatures and things like that. So I just posted a link to that in the chat. So it's very helpful, useful information as well. Anyone have anything else they want to add?
I'm just wondering if the person asked the question thinking of 504B161 subdivision 1(3), where it talks about to make premises in all common areas reasonably energy efficient by installing weather stripping, caulking, storm windows, and storm doors when any such measure will result, Jesus, in energy procurement cost savings, etc. So, like Matt said, the cabin issue, that's definitely an emergency situation. With the warp door, I would submit a rent escrow maintenance request and then file a rent escrow unless it's really drafty and it's affecting maintaining heat in your rental at least 68 degrees.
I was hoping someone was going to bring that up because that is one of, I think, the most overlooked parts of this statute is the fact that there is this weatherization requirement that I'm not aware of any like cases or litigation that has gone through based on that particular area, but it is something that as obviously these tenants know, like it can make a big difference. So again, the statute that Amo was just talking about is actually the same one that I just posted in the chat. I'll post it again. Someone was just asking for it. So I'm posting all of the statute numbers here in the chat for folks to be able to refer back to. All right. Okay. And then, yeah, I think again, if you are emailing Homeline, Mary Rose, make sure that you're using the email and attorney form. Again, that email that we have listed there, it's not actually an email address, it's a page to where you can submit an email through that way. So I know that sometimes that gets confusing for some folks. So, all righty. So let's continue moving on. All right. Shelly has a question about, all right. Oh, I like this one. All right, Shelly, we're going to start with this one. Shelly has a lot of questions that's coming through, which is great. Keep bringing them on. But Shelly is wondering, is there ever going to be a standard lease for everybody? Mike?
I'd bet against that. Leases are, generally speaking, a contract between two or more adults usually that decide that they want to agree on something. And in Minnesota, There are probably 5 or 7 leases used regularly by landlords, but there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of leases used in Minnesota. Landlords will minorly adjust the lease to fit whatever they want. When it comes to residential leases, tenants very rarely have any real bargaining power to change the lease, but landlords make modifications to leases frequently. And they put in the rules that they want to have for the property that they own. And I have seen no legislative effort in this state to require one standardized lease. I honestly don't know if it exists in other states or not. It's nothing we've ever really thought about much because we haven't really seen a push for it. Certainly no landlord groups that I know of are looking for that kind of mandate that it's one lease for everybody. The State Bar Association has a model residential lease, but it's not, again, a state required lease. Occasionally you'll see a lease that says at the top of it that it's been I've heard landlords tell me my lease has been approved by the Attorney General's office, by the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and that's just never the case. They don't approve anybody's lease. They say that the language in the lease might be understandable. That's all the Attorney General's stamp of approval really signifies when it comes to a lease. But the Attorney General's office does not put a stamp of approval on the actual content of a lease. And leases are, they can take weird shapes and forms. I think the most commonly used lease we see right now is 51 pages long with the addendums included. But that's not the only lease, like I say, and we do see that all the way down to a lease that a landlord has handwritten on their own, sometimes in cursive, sometimes on a cocktail napkin. I haven't done as many of these presentations in recent times as I did when COVID first hit in 2020, and we were doing them actually twice a week. We were doing about 4 hours of speeches a week because we wanted to have ones for landlords and tenants to make sure everybody understand all the rules as they were shifting around. Yeah, leases are, they can be very unique. They can have odd phrasing involved in them. And some landlords really want to have their own stamp on it. And landlords pick the lease in general. I mean, that's just how it works in residential landlord-tenant law, which is why we have laws that try to balance out the playing field to some degree, because landlords put whatever they prefer to have in their lease, and the law tries to balance it out because this is housing and probably the biggest bill in everybody's life, and we've got to have some regulation on it.
All right, thank you. Anyone have anything to add? All right, Matt, you are up. And we've got a landlord who is asking, they've started noticing more and more tenants putting up video doorbells on their units, and some capture other tenants' entry doors. Is there any issue with this related to privacy laws? We don't have an issue with tenants putting them up, but I want to make sure that we're not allowing something that violates other tenants' privacy.
Yeah, I think by and large, what happens in sort of open public space is open for view and probably open for recording. I think there probably gets to be an issue if you're using it for some sort of commercial purpose to make money off of it, right? But when you walk outside your door and you go into the great wide world, there is just not a big expectation of privacy that you have. So it is weird. We do get these phone calls. My neighbor has cameras pointed at my house, or I think my neighbors are stealing my packages, right? Both ways. It could be the same call for all we know, right? But these things, I think in this modern world with cameras so easily obtained and so easily set up, I think once you step outside your house, the expectation of privacy just evaporates.
Yeah. Anything from other folks?
Yeah, on the camera thing, this isn't exactly the question, but one thing that we've had lots of tenants over the years say that they think that somebody's coming into their place and maybe taking things or doing stuff they shouldn't be doing in there. There's no law stopping you from setting up some type of, in your apartment camera. We have seen footage that tenants have sent us, which I get speeches frequently to landlord groups, and I tell them every time, you should assume you're being recorded when you walk into a tenant's unit to fix something, because I've seen those recordings and you're not always fixing stuff, and they record it and they might want to take action if you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing. So the camera inside the unit is very different from the camera that's outside. It's not exactly what was asked, but it's one of those things that we get asked that's sort of a cousin of that question.
Thank you.
I think we should point out Minnesota is a one-party consent state. So this is why people record freely out in the world. So I mean,
Can you,
as of right now, there
Can
is
you
no
just
law that's
define what a one-party
Yeah.
consent
oh
state is for everybody?
that's,
yeah, I
yeah.
should. So it
Yes.
means that you basically can record you're going to be in the video with your voice. You're the one taking the video, and you don't have to ask anyone for permission to record them. You're the consenter because you're in the video. But keep in mind that that's in public. Once you're in someone's private space, things get a little bit murkier. Which is why a camera inside your house is okay if you authorize, you're the one who put it, you can record anyone who comes into your space. But having, for example, your landlord or your neighbor come into your house and set up a camera to record you is very illegal. I loved your face, Matt.
We've had that case. We've had those calls. Yeah.
They
Um,
are incredibly disturbing and incredibly illegal.
yeah, incredibly illegal. However, I think one of the things that landlords should consider, and this is not to discourage the use of Ring cameras or whatever the most popular one in the market is that you want to make sure people are comfortable and that people aren't being harassed. If you have a neighbor that has, you're renting a house and they have cameras facing your backyard, you start getting really uncomfortable. So I think there would be an argument to be made of the amount of cameras that are pointed towards your house. And I mentioned this, I've never seen it happen in Minnesota, but I've seen it happen in other states with excessive cameras pointing towards people's backyards.
Gotcha. All right. So I'm sorry, I'm looking for that. I'm gonna put this question from Shelley to you because it's kind of similar in scope. Can landlord ask tenants to report other tenants and get money off rent, calling it a neighborhood watch?
Um, there's nothing, I don't believe there's anything in the law that says that they can't. It's not something I would encourage. Uh, it's very 1984,
Narc,
USSR like, yeah.
yeah, narc on your neighbors.
Um, yeah, I've never actually heard this. What about Mike and Matt?
That's a new one for me. Yeah, that's a new one for me. I mean, I guess you can ask anything you
Yeah.
want, I suppose. I don't know that that's a good business practice. I guess I'm not in the business of being a landlord, but I sometimes, try to put on that hat and think, is this going to help me find tenants and retain tenants in a long-term way? And I don't know.
Can you
I
say
don't
the
know if this
question
would.
again, Rachel?
So the question was, can landlord ask tenants to report other tenants and get money off rent, calling it a neighborhood watch?
All right, so what you guys are seeing is something that happens in our office somewhat regularly, which is we sort of do a group think. It's not always live. Sometimes it's exchanging some information on a inter-office chat that we have. But we have 12 attorneys working for us right now and lots of other staff that are very informed on many of these issues. And we try to figure out the answer to a question if it's something we haven't heard before. But Ama's first I think comment was she didn't think there was anything illegal about it, which is kind of the threshold question in landlord-tenant law, because as we just talked about, landlords always write the lease. So the law steps in to try to balance the playing field between the lease and the law. And so if there's not a law that specifically prohibits it, the default is it's usually legal for the landlord to do. That doesn't mean it's a good idea, nor do I know that it's an effective I'm trying to play this out in my mind. Let's say a landlord decides to go file an eviction based on some information obtained from this bounty paid information that they got from a neighbor. The question that the attorney would ask on the other side, representing the tenant who's being blamed for this bad behavior, is how much is it that you got paid for this information? What happens if you gave no information? Would you still get paid? So you've got a financial incentive to come up with this information that you just provided. So I think it waters down the impact of what the neighbor might be reporting on, because they're getting incentivized monetarily, maybe before they even give the information. I mean, it's why you'll see that in all kinds of levels of trials, that somebody's credibility will be questioned because there was a deal in place for them to testify as they are testifying. So although we haven't heard that exact question before, I'm not sure how much it really would benefit the landlord in the end. And that's probably why we haven't heard it. I don't think it's a great landlord maneuver. It doesn't mean they wouldn't try it necessarily. Different landlords try different things, but it certainly is not industry-wide.
It's also they still have to prove their case in court. Say, you know, if this were going to end up in an eviction. I'm just thinking, someone's complaining about drug use in a unit. The landlord still has to prove that it was the drugs were being used. And so how do you do that? Okay, you can bring in the neighbor who provided the information and put them on the stand, assuming it goes to trial. They're going to be questioned, and there might be issues with the proof in the case. It's just a sense. I mean, it doesn't seem to be illegal based on our knowledge of the law right now. But yeah, how
It's
useful can
creepy,
this be? Yeah.
and it's not great business, right? I mean, if you're being paid to, you know, tell on your neighbors, then you must assume that they're being paid to tell on you as well. At least a smart person would think that. And so, yeah, I think that would ratchet up the tension in a neighborhood in a hurry.
All right, Mike.
Boo, boo, I say.
Shelly was the one who asked this question, right? I really
Yes.
want to get more information from her because I'm like, who's doing this?
So yeah, Shelley, if you want to message us specifically, like who's doing this and that sort of thing, that's a very specific,
Mhm.
question and context issue. So you can feel free, if someone is doing
Right.
this, we want to know about it, but you can message us directly about that. Um, okay, so Mike, I'm going to ask you uh, a very current question.
Mhm.
What are lawmakers doing to protect housing choice voucher tenants? This is from Kim Nielsen. They are a tenant. Their question goes on to say tenants are being advised not to get a lease and end up in month to months getting the landlord the ability to raise the rent at any time with a 2-month notice. So obviously there's some specific issues here with rent increases, it sounds like, but housing choice vouchers are also called Section 8. That's an old name for them. It's a subsidy that is done through HUD. Um, so there's some, basically there's been some happenings at the federal level of government about funding different programs and agencies and such, that there was some concern about whether some of these programs like housing choice vouchers would be funded under the some of the executive orders that the president had put out there. So, do you know of anything that lawmakers are doing to protect housing choice voucher tenants, either locally or nationally?
Look, I'm sure that there is efforts being done legislatively to protect not just housing choice voucher programs, but hundreds, thousands of programs at the federal and state level. How effective those efforts are going to be right now is difficult to divine, really. Predicting what's going to happen politically seems even more difficult now than it has been in past administrations. I mean, you're never really sure where somebody's going to go, but there seems to be more almost intentional unknowns right now than there have been in the past. And so this is truly a stay tuned thing. But I mean, at the federal level, the votes are where they are. The Republicans control the Senate, the House, and the White House. And so if they want to change legislation, if they want to push legislation through, the only thing stopping them realistically for 2 years is themselves. And so that's who's making the votes. I'm not sure if anybody watching today is in an area of Minnesota where your House of Representatives member is a Republican, but those votes are the ones that can be difference makers. It seems like party line votes are happening mostly at the federal level. So a Democrat voting against something that the Republicans are trying to do probably would be somewhat inconsequential, at least for now. But a Republican voting against something, and if any elected official gets a lot of input from their constituents in their area, it's hard to ignore it once the volume of that gets loud enough. And so, as trite as it might sound, talking to your elected official about what you want to have happen can matter, and it frequently does matter. And so that's what you can try. And then when the next election rolls around, you try to elect people you want to elect, or help them get elected if it's something that you're passionate about or impacts you greatly. Sorry to give a trite answer, like I said, but we have the administration we have right now.
I do want to say, specifically for the question, it says that they are advised, the tenants are advised not to get a lease, and they end up in these month-to-month leases where the landlord can raise the rent at any time within a 2-month period. And so
I was going to make those follow-up questions here, Amma, so you're way ahead of me. Thank you.
so I think with the housing choice program, there's a cap into how much a person can pay for rent. And landlords who are in these types of programs are also, they want to keep the property in the program. So I think I would like to see a specific example or how this has happened to someone in order to better guide them as to how to handle it. I don't think it's as common right now as one would think it could be. Just because when you're a landlord who rents people with a subsidized housing, you want to stay in that sort of environment. It basically helps you keep the property constantly rented. It's a constant source of income. So the raising the rent part would most likely be less than if you were in a market rate unit.
Yeah, and I know that there's a push at the Minnesota legislature for the last few years, I mean, probably for the last decade or two, of putting source of income protections, including housing choice vouchers, as part of essentially it's protected class, basically saying that landlords can't deny you if you receive a housing choice voucher. So there's that part is happening as well. So yeah, it sounds like there's some very specific things happening in your situation. I don't know if we've heard of anyone who's like as a trend, overall of people being advised, and who's doing the advising? Is it the landlord? Is it HUD? Like, that there's some other questions here about the specific situations that sounds like we would be more than happy to talk to you about. So if you want to give us a call or an email, that'd be awesome. Okay. Okay, so Shelly again has some questions. This is going to be about abandoned property, which is always a fun topic. Matt, I think you're up.
Oh,
Uh, right? Look at the excitement in his face. Ooh, abandoned property. Shelly is specifically saying what can be done when no inventory is done in an eviction by cops or landlord, and they keep it says list for 3 years. I'm not 100% certain what means by keep list 3 years, but what happens in an eviction action and abandoned property that has been left behind after the tenant is either vacates or is removed from the property by the sheriff. And
Yeah, yeah. After an eviction action, the judge rules the sheriff can remove the tenant. The sheriff comes and removes the tenant. What happens to the stuff left behind? What's supposed to happen is the landlord and the sheriff are supposed to do an inventory of what's left behind, and then the landlord is required to store that property. Um, the rules are a little strangely written. Sometimes it's 28 days, sometimes it's 60 days. But during that time, the tenant has a right to reclaim the property. They have to demand the property. In writing is always best. And if the landlord can't destroy the property until the end of that timeline. If the tenant cannot get the property, the landlord won't give the tenant the property. If the property has been destroyed before the deadline is up, the tenant has a right to sue for the value of what was destroyed, 3 times the value of what was destroyed, in fact, or $1,000, whichever is greater. Here, the question is, what if they never do that inventory? I think there's a claim against the landlord and maybe the sheriff. I feel like one of our other attorneys, talked about a case where the sheriff didn't do their responsibility. I think it's going to be tough to sue the sheriff's department. Um, it's even tough to sue the landlord on these claims, just because it's difficult to prove what you owned. Pictures are going to help. Receipts. Who keeps receipts of all the stuff that we have in our homes? That's a very difficult thing. If
Yeah,
they
you might be
decide,
able to track back on credit cards if you used a credit card to buy stuff. So you might not have the
Mhm.
paper receipt, but you might have access to it. You're right, though. Proof is a big problem with that.
Yeah. Um, but the most important thing, as a tenant is to make the demand for the property early. So you lock in those rights to demand the property, and then you maintain the right to file a claim.
all right. Sorry, I'm trying to put in our form for written demand for property. All right. Next up. Um, when this is from Anonymous, I'm not sure if they're a tenant or I'm assuming they're a tenant. But when applying for a rental, and they deny you due to rental history, are they obligated to disclose why you are denied?
So you are entitled, the landlord has to provide you the information of the agencies that did your screening. And so through that, you will find out why you were denied. And I believe you have 60 days to get the information. So it will be on the letter, the denial letter. And you just contact the screening agency and they will provide you the information.
Yeah, so that's all right. Just a little bit more about the logistics. So if you've applied with a landlord, they charged an application fee, $30, $50. Then they turn you down. They have to disclose the name of the screening agency they used, if they used one, which almost every landlord does. Then the screening agency has to give you, the tenant, directly a copy of what they gave the landlord. And it's free if you've been denied within the last 60 days. And so we really stress that this is a good step for a tenant to take, especially if they have a common name of any type. There might be all kinds of incorrect information. My name is not that common, but there's still some stuff that shows up for me that, I never lived in that state, or things like that. And so it can happen to anybody. You want to see what you're up against and what the next landlord might see as well when you apply.
I think it's worth saying also, if you're going to pay an application fee, the landlord needs to provide you with a list of criteria saying why you will or won't be accepted as a tenant. And if you are rejected for a reason that was listed in the criteria, uh, you don't get your money back. That was listed, it was notified, you applied, the law views it as you should have known better, essentially. But if you're denied for a reason that is not listed in the criteria, you're entitled to sue for the return of your deposit plus some extra damages on top of that. Um, as a landlord, I think you want to say, this is why I denied you. This is the reason. Saying something like, well, I don't have to tell you, I think really invites more questions, because why wouldn't you say why? Is it because there's not a good reason? Is it because of some forbidden reason that you won't rent to me? Those are questions that get asked. Those are questions that I ask when someone doesn't say why, because maybe there is a perfectly reasonable reason. An eviction that happened 2 months ago, or a very bad credit that fell beyond the credit standards the landlord wants, right? These are all reasons that are allowed. So yeah, they should include criteria for why you'll be accepted as well.
You actually want to ask for that criteria if they don't provide it to you. I'm loathe landlords who don't tell, upfront to tenants, this is what I'm looking for in a tenant. Because, it costs money. So I think that's one of those things that you, as a tenant, would be like, is this a place I really want to apply to rent? And as a landlord, you really want to have your ducks in a row, make sure that you set up just good business practices, set up the criteria of the type of tenant that you're looking for, and then go from there. It takes you like 5 to 10 minutes to set that up. Just make a list, and then it'll save you a lifetime of possible pain.
Yeah, and for the landlords watching, I mean, Matt's right. You're supposed to, if you charge a fee, have written criteria, but the law doesn't say how specific the criteria has to be, unfortunately. And so some landlords will say my screening criteria is I look at your criminal credit and rental history, but it doesn't say what you need to qualify. And for instance, like with credit, I mean, a credit score is a numeric number between 300 and 850, and landlords know what they want for that number. They just might not write it down. But I would caution landlords, it doesn't do you much good to turn somebody down. That's not really what you've designed tenant screening for, to turn somebody down. You want to get people that you say yes to, and they're more likely to be people you say yes to if you tell them all about what your criteria really are. And so disclosing that up front, that specificity, while not technically required by the law, is the best business move. Again, you're going to have an upset person if you've turned them down. They might leave a bad review, and they might feel like they have footing for doing that. And there's not a lot you can do to fight that. And so I think telegraphing that as a landlord is something I wish more landlords would do.
I can't hear Rachel.
Sorry, I had muted myself so that you didn't hear me typing away on all of my things. Shelley is also asking, and I think this segues nicely into, why do landlords get to do background checks if a tenant or prospective tenant has already done a background check to be part of like a subsidy or some other program? Are they allowed to do that? I guess is maybe one place to start. Are landlords allowed to force a tenant to do a secondary background check?
Yeah, I think a landlord can say, I only want to trust my background check. A sort of common sort of corollary to that question is, I just did a background check 2 weeks ago. Why can't I show my landlord that background check that I'm applying to? Or a different landlord, this old background check that I just had 2 weeks ago. But the landlord, I think, is allowed to run their own background check. And that's my answer. They're allowed to, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah, again, that's our starting question. Is there a law that prohibits this from what a landlord is trying to do? And if there isn't, then probably it's legal.
Mhm. Yeah, and if there's stuff on there that, might be raise red flags, then, having trying to either get it off of your record if it's a problem, or just giving the landlord the heads up before you even bother, giving your application fee, is like, look, this is what you're going to see, should I even bother applying? Or this is why this is not an issue anymore, and this is why I'm going to be an awesome renter for you. Because remember, you're an awesome renter. You just need to show the landlord why you're awesome. What makes you so awesome? Like any other job interview. All right. Okay, so we're gonna move on to, I think we're back to Amma. Um, All right. Are rent payments, this is from Anonymous, are rent payments or security deposits paid through apps like Venmo or Cash App considered to be legal payments if the landlord were to lose or mishandle them?
Well, landlords have to actually put that money into um, an account that accrues interest at 1% a year. So um, that's the first piece.
That's just on
Second,
deposits though,
right.
right?
Oh,
That you're
she's
talking.
talking about rent payments.
Well, it
It
says
says
both.
payments and security deposits.
Okay, so that was just for the security deposit piece.
Mhm.
For regular rent payments, Venmo and Cash App, yeah, they're considered legal payments. I think the key thing here is to make sure that you keep your receipts, like take a screenshot of the payment you've made to Cash App, that it goes to the account that your landlord gave you to, to send it to their Cash App account. Um, and if the landlord loses or mishandles them, um, rent is considered paid when they receive payment. Cash App and Venmo remove the money automatically from your account. If the landlord loses their password to Cash App or Venmo or whatever, they get their account stolen or whatever, you've paid your rent. You just need to have your evidence. And I believe in your bank account, it will show that you paid X person via Cash App or, well, at least Venmo, will pop up with it will be classified as such in your bank account. Um, so you don't have to worry about that piece. If the landlord tries to come after you for that and they say, I never received the payment, you have your evidence. If they file for eviction for your non-payment of rent, you're going to have the evidence. It's going to be up to them to prove that there's actually a debt. But the key here is keep a screenshot of what you've paid.
And I
The one
think
thing I'll add on there is Amma had mentioned that the security deposit gets 1% interest, but there is no requirement that the landlords keep that money in a specific account. Many states do require that. But here in Minnesota, if the landlord wants to bury your deposit in the backyard, there's nothing stopping them. They just have to pay a 1% interest, no matter where it was. So, because if it is buried in the backyard, it's not going to accrue interest, but they have to pay the 1% interest. So, um,
but the interest of like acorns and other, potential
Mold,
lichen, yeah, mushrooms maybe. I mean,
barrels of money.
how can you not?
sure.
I-
I had a
Thanks for
landlord
that
who,
visual.
oh, I shouldn't.
Yeah. All right. I know Matt is going to have to leave here in a few minutes, and I wanted to ask this landlord question from for all of you because I think this is something that we've talked about in the office but haven't necessarily come to a conclusion about. So, landlord is saying, I'm a landlord and a tenant is requesting that the vents air ducts in their units get cleaned. I've performed research and I haven't found anything that states that there is a requirement of landlords to clean vents. I've also found many sources that state that vent cleaning isn't necessary, including the EPA website, and that vents and ducts can be damaged as a result. While discussing with the tenant, she stated that the vents not being cleaned are causing health issues. I didn't ask for further details on the health issues due to privacy. What should I do in this situation? Should I have the vents cleaned and risk damage to vent ducts? Should I continue to explain to the tenant about lack of requirements and that we don't typically clean vents?
Oh, this is a really good question, because it hits on a lot of different things. Um, what is reasonable repair? What is fit for the use intended? Um, I think we spent 3 months in law school talking about what reasonable means. It's one of these wonderful legal words that mean nothing, but also everything. And so what? So this is my glib answer to that. That's what judges are for, right? When parties have a dispute about what is required under a contract, eventually it's the judge who decides what's needed and what's required. This is why it makes it so interesting to me in a strange sort of way, is that it costs time, effort, and money to go to court. It's not free. There is a psychological weight that goes with filing a case. There are filing fees that go with filing a case. There are often attorney's fees that go with filing a case. And so to get your answer for what is required, you can either negotiate about it between the parties and come to some sort of agreement about what should or shouldn't be done, or how the repairs should or shouldn't be split. But if the parties can't come to some sort of agreement, then the judge decides, and that gets into a whole other different sort of set of things to think about, is settlement at court, and proving your case, and how will the judge decide these things. So it's a really interesting question, one I do not have an answer for. I can't say whether duct cleaning is required or isn't required. It would fit into sort of this what is reasonable, and that is a moving target when you're talking about, it is what the judge says it is.
Yeah, I mean, Matt is right. There's no statute that says specifically, yes, duct cleaning must be done every 8.5 years. There just isn't. You could try a sort of a reasonable accommodation requirement or argument as a tenant. It could be a negotiated thing, like Matt mentioned. This is one of those things where it might be split between the two parties. The landlord doesn't think it really needs to be done, but the tenant really cares about it passionately, so they split the cost. But I will say this, tenants rarely think of themselves as the customer. That word is not used interchangeably. I think we have in our society this concept of the customer is always right. And landlords don't regularly use the word customer when they describe the people who are living in their facilities. But they are customers, right? And so as a customer, you can say, hey, look, I'm paying for a service and I'm not satisfied with it, and this is how I want it to be resolved. And sometimes it works. I mean, most landlords are decent people trying to do a decent job, and they'll listen. And maybe it can be some sort of agreement can be reached. If not, that's what Matt just pointed out. We have judges that will decide things, and that's about the only answer we can give on this question. Is it's whatever a judge thinks needs to be done, looking at what all the evidence that gets put in. Yeah.
It's difficult. It costs time, effort, and money to move. If I'm being a landlord, being a tenant is not exactly the sort of customer interaction we think of. If I go to a restaurant and get a substandard hamburger, well, I can go to a different restaurant. There's 1,000 restaurants that'll serve me a better hamburger. It's easy to go down the street. It's really hard to move. At the same time, it's not that easy to find a new tenant. A tenant moves out, you're going to have an empty unit for 2-3 months. Maybe there's some damage left behind. We just don't know. There is, because of that, there's this motivation from the parties to work it out. And how that looks, they split it, maybe they just ignore it. I don't know exactly, right? But it is not a typical customer relationship, right? But that again, don't get me started. I'm about to get started on a lot of
I
things.
think you did get started, but
I did get started.
yeah,
That's why there's so
yeah,
many protections, right? That's why there are other protections
right.
in law,
But
because this isn't, you can't just go down the
yeah,
street.
I get that, but I think that tenants and landlords both forget that one party is paying for a service.
Yeah.
And they seem to think that it's not, that there's actually a movement these days where landlords don't like the phrase or word landlord. They want to be called housing providers or some other phrase. A couple issues with that. First of all, we actually have a whole chapter of law in Minnesota called landlord tenant law, where we actually define the word landlord. It's not meant to be pejorative. It's just meant to be the word that people have used for centuries. But there is kind of this whole concept of, I mean, if you think of those two words, tenant doesn't sound anywhere near as powerful as lord of the land. That sounds much more powerful. And so it's not exactly a balanced relationship. However, the tenant is the one paying. And so they're the customer. And that's at its core, that's where tenant rights come from, is, hey, we got to have some protection for the people paying when they otherwise don't have protection. But I get your point that it's a lot easier to go get a burger down the street somewhere else than it is to get a new place to live, for sure.
I just want to say to the landlord who asked the question, one of the things you can do is do an inspection, look at the vents, see how they're looking. I have never heard that vent cleaning could damage the system or the vents. That's new information for me. But I think you need to weigh the inconvenience of having to go to court if the tenant chooses to take you to court, the cost of just having the vents clean and sort of, for lack of a better way of saying it, getting rid of the problem. And then the issue of like there might be dirt in there. So then this whole concept of is the property in reasonable repair and fit for its intended use and purposes comes to play. Because if the vents are dirty and it's causing allergies or triggering asthma, then that's an issue. The default, and I don't think this is where you're coming from at all. But the default should never be, well, nothing tells me that I have to do this specifically. The default should instead be, okay, the tenant is a client. How can I make this a place for them to continue living so that I can continue getting rent? So those are my 2 cents.
Nice. All right. Uh, Matt, before you go, one last question. I think this one's going to be pretty straightforward. How do low-income tenants afford to go to court?
If there's one thing I've learned, a straightforward question is never straightforward. But this one is. You can, surprise. You can file for a filing fee waiver based on income. There's a form you can fill out at the court. And you swear, penalty of perjury. This is my income, or I received this sort of means tested form of public assistance, and that can be used to get the fee waived.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. See you later.
All right. I know I put that to Matt, but I think we're on to Amma in our round robin.
Yes.
So this one is an interesting one and has deals with some of the newer laws that went into effect last year or this year, excuse me. If an employee of a management company is also a resident, is that person permitted to attend tenant association meetings, 504B.212, which is the new tenant right to organize statute? Says management representatives cannot attend meetings, but it also states that landlords cannot prohibit residents, which may include this resident employees, from participating in tenant association activities.
So I think the question that would need to be answered first is this employee caretaker, for example, a management employee? And why are they going to the meeting, right? I think it would be really hard for someone to say currently the law was just enacted. So there's no litigation on it as of yet. There's other than the law itself, there's little guidance in terms of interpretation. So what I would say is if it's a tenant, you can't say you can't attend the meeting because they're a tenant. If there are issues where this person is sort of relaying information to management that should remain with tenants, then that might be something that could be litigated for clarity in the law. But if they are a tenant and they're paying rent, really they have a right to attend the meeting. They have a right to organize against their own employer if necessary.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Amma. All right. Mike, you are up. Okay, so we have just under 30 minutes left of our time here, and we've got 21 open questions. So again, if you've got questions, burning questions, put them in the Q&A, please, just so that I see them and we can try and keep track of them in an organized way. I do not know if we're going to get to everything. These are great questions with some great discussion, so thank you so much for submitting them. We're going to continue on with this. All right, so Anonymous wants to know, they are a tenant, what types of maintenance requests are landlords able to charge residents for, and what can one do if they feel they have been overcharged? Are there any alternatives to taking it to court if your lease also states you must compensate your manager's legal fees in that sort of case?
Okay, so to start with, this sounds like there's a built-in clause in the lease where the landlord is charging if the tenant makes a call. Is that what we think this is saying?
Yes. So it sounds
Okay.
like what types of maintenance requests are landlords able to charge residents for?
Okay. So if that's what we're talking about here, there is a law. Again, we go back to 504B.161 that says that a landlord can only charge tenant for any kind of damages if the tenant causes those damages either willfully, maliciously, or irresponsibly. Willfully meaning on purpose, maliciously meaning, I guess, really on purpose, with an, I always say with an evil laugh. And irresponsibly is the last, and that's the one that landlords typically rely on. But some sort of blanket charge. I'm going to charge you $50 to come out and have a look at the sink that you tell me is leaking is pretty suspect legally on its face. And a landlord trying to, require those payments to be made. First of all, they're very short-sighted. That's just terrible landlording from a what's this going to cost me to be a landlord and what's the profit that I can get to. And if you think about what a tenant actually is, among other things, they're a paying house sitter and they're the ones that are there every day. If there's something wrong, a landlord actually wants a tenant to tell the landlord that there's something wrong. They'd wish that there wasn't something wrong, but if there is, they want to know about it. Leaking faucets never get better on their own. They get worse. And so if I'm a landlord, I'm going to want to know about that stuff. And so throwing around fees because somebody calls to have maintenance come out to have something looked at is just, I think, misguided by landlords to do. And it's not what the best landlords do in this state. It's not common at all.
I concur. I mean, I think I've seen some really, I mean, they look like really old leases, like from the 60s or something, that the landlords have kept using. Well, they'll say that the tenant is responsible, like for plumbing repairs because they've sent that inspector and the inspector says that the plumbing is okay. So those fees, again, the landlord has to follow the law where they can only charge the tenant if they meet the lawful, willful, or irresponsible standard. That was not the standard. Willful, malicious, or irresponsible standard. Sorry. Um, so if this issue pops up, you can go to our website, and then we have a letter there for when the landlord bills you for repairs. You can send that to the landlord, and then if they don't remove the charge and you're very certain that this is an illegal charge, then you go ahead and file in court. That's your remedy. You would file a rent escrow action over that.
Awesome. Thank you, Amma. Yeah, you missed out on Mike's favorite word there, malicious.
I know. Like
All right,
literally my brain just went like, whoa.
nice. All right. So the Mike, I'm just going to keep on going down the line. In a previous webinar, attorney indicated that a manager can evict you for any reason. So can an apartment manager evict you for asserting your rights even after the 14-day request? Is there a certain statute to state in your repair request?
So I don't know I don't watch or attend all the prior webinars, but I don't know of an attorney saying that a manager can evict you for any reason. What they might have said is they can non-renew your lease for any reason, which is very different than an eviction. An eviction is, and I don't mean to be all lawyerly about this. It matters for if you're applying for another place and you've had a landlord not renew your lease or give you a notice to vacate, and the next landlord asks, have you ever been evicted before? That is not an eviction. An eviction means a court case was filed by the landlord. And so can a landlord evict you for any reason? The technical answer is no. They cannot evict you for any reason. The most common reason for evictions is non-payment of rent. Sometimes it's maybe an unauthorized occupant, maybe a pet when you're not supposed to have one. But as far as non-renewals go, if you're in private market housing, there's a good chance, in fact, this is the general rule, is the landlord does not have to give a reason to not renew your contract. So that part does happen. Not often, because landlords are not in the non-renewal business. They're in the rent collection business. They lose money on turnovers, but occasionally they do decide to not renew people. The second part of the question, I think, is asking about retaliation, where somebody's maybe asserted a right. So can the landlord take adverse action against you because you asked for repairs to be made, something like that? Look, retaliation laws are not perfect, but they are there. And that makes it really difficult for a landlord if you've asserted your rights as a tenant for 90 days. There's a 90-day window where it's presumed that any adverse action, non-renewals, raising the rent, taking away the key to the workout area, it's presumed to be retaliatory. And so during that time, the retaliation footing for a tenant is strongest. After the 90 days, the burden, as lawyers obsess over, shifts to the tenant, where they would have to prove that it was retaliatory. So there is some protection. It's not perfect, but that's a quick run through of retaliation law.
I do want to point out that we have a letter on our website that you can send the landlord if you feel like they've retaliated against you. It's just a warning. It does help, you know, to make people aware of the law, the landlord's aware of the law. So this
I
is like, I
included a
guess,
link
my
to it.
pitch. Yeah, I
Yep.
think this is my pitch. Go to our website and look at the free form letters that we have, because they will help you with a lot of the sort of most common questions and letters that tenants tend to need from attorneys.
Mhm. All right, Amma, since you're here, um, this is something that we kind of hear a lot about. If your apartment is constantly switching property managers, are they able to charge, or excuse me, change any fees, charges, or rules listed in your lease?
So if you're in a term lease, you know, say you sign the lease January 1st, it ends next year, or it ends this year on December 31st. So the terms of those lease, the clauses on the lease cannot be unilaterally changed. This is just basic contract law. If you're in a month-to-month lease, the landlord can make changes to the lease, but they have to give you proper notice. Generally speaking, in month-to-month leases, what we see most common is a 30-day notice. But when you have been on a term lease, usually the term lease had a 60-day notice. And so you went month to month, that 60-day notice continues. You have to look at the lease to see what the notice period is. If there's no language on that, then it will be 30 days. But if you're talking more about sort of rules that are not listed on the lease, like more of a pool rules or common area rules, those are a little bit different, because those are not lease terms. So there can be changes in hours, like the fee that they normally charge for using those party rooms. Like those things might change if it's not listed on the lease. So the quick answer is it doesn't matter if the managers change 20 times in a year. The manager doesn't get to decide the terms of the lease. Your lease determines the terms of the lease, and that's why what you have to go back to.
All right. Thank you. All right. Mike, you're up. All right. So I don't quite some of this question I don't quite understand. I'm going to read it and maybe we can piece it out a little bit together because it has to do with non-emergency repairs and repairs in general. And I think they might be conflating a couple of laws.
Yeah.
So as a landlord, it is taking longer to do non-emergency repairs with the new law on giving 24-hour notice in writing than it did before. But the work is usually repaired within a week, where before it was done within a day or so. I don't know if this is a question so much as a comment on the new
Feels pretty
privacy statute.
commenty.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that they're just saying that the non-emergency repairs are not, you know, they're taking them longer to finish.
Yep. Okay. So lots of thoughts on this. As somebody that worked on the legislation and has worked with the previous legislation that we had from the mid 90s on, when it comes to when a landlord is allowed to enter a rental unit to make repairs. Number one, a landlord can always knock on the door and say, "Can I come in?" That's always been true. It's still true. What we care about is when can the landlord use their key, right? So that's when they don't need the tenant's permission. They say, "Hey, look, I'm coming over on Friday. I'll be there at 10 o'clock and I'm going to let myself in if you're not around." That's what we care about. That's what this law, the new law, cares about, that requires a 24-hour notice. So during this season, I don't know how cold it is out today, 10 degrees maybe. If somebody's furnace goes out and they ask the landlord to fix the problem, I can virtually guarantee you that if the landlord says, "You know what, I called every furnace guy in town and somebody can get there, but they can't get there till about 11:30 tonight. Do you want them to come?" Every tenant is going to say, "Yes, I want them to come. My family's in danger. I want the furnace guy to come over, even if it's 11:30 at night." And so the 24-hour thing is only if the landlord is trying to go in without the tenant saying, yes, please come in. So you can always ask, but what this law really wants you to do is make sure that the tenant knows you're coming with as much notice as you can give them. It used to say reasonable notice, now it says 24 hours, but that's again when you're unilaterally deciding I'm coming in on this day and whether you're around or not. I will say this, there is a lot of um, opposition from landlord lobbyists about many of the landlord tenant laws that have changed in the last couple of years. And some of them you can point at and say, oh, that's a pretty progressive left-wing thinking law. I'm not naive enough to think that that's not true. But this law that we're talking about, the 24-hour rule, is true in more than half the states. This isn't radical stuff. And plenty of those states are very ruby red political states, and they still require 24 hours notice. This is using a key to enter somebody's home. And that's a pretty big responsibility. And you'll have to take our word for it. We get lots of calls from people that are upset about how they've been treated. Their 13-year-old daughter's home alone after school doing homework. And, they had no idea that somebody was coming in to change the furnace filter, which is a very innocent and necessary step. But the tenant would have planned their life around that if they had known when the landlord was coming. And so they didn't have that awkward moment where their daughter's freaked out, understandably so. So yeah, this is a very what would you want if you were living there kind of rule. It always has been in my mind. And that's what I would like to see landlords do, and most do. Most try to give as much notice as they can. I understand the concern, but if somebody asks for a repair and you say, you know what, I can be there tomorrow at 8 and it's only 3 o'clock right now, and they say, fine, come over at 8, that's fine. The 24-hour notice isn't necessary if they let you in.
All right, fabulous. Thank you. All right, so we're just under 15 minutes here. We still have a bunch of questions, so we'll see how many we get through. Uh, but let's see. Next question. I'm just starting to go in order at this point. Gigi from us says, Amma, this is about recording minors in public spaces. Do you have anything to kind of add to what you were talking about earlier with that?
I mean, it's Minnesota as a one-party consent state. It's creepy. Um, but there's nothing illegal in the law right now that says that you can't record minors in public spaces. There's just no expectation of privacy.
And I think that's the expectation of privacy is the big kind of legal
Yeah.
thought, is that if you're in a space that you have no expectation that, someone else wouldn't be able to just walk in on what you're doing. And, even though if you're in a secured building in an apartment, there's still other people that live there and they could, walk across the kids playing in the hall anyway. So, that
And
makes
I
sense.
mean, we're focusing really on the type of recording. And we're talking about it, there's a Ring camera that's facing the hallway, obviously, so you can see who's at your door, and there are kids playing in the hallway and it's catching them. Wow, that's going to be super annoying for the person with the Ring camera because the alerts are going to keep popping up. But there's, it's just kids playing. But there's, let me not go into like my dark thinking. Let's think positive.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Gotcha. All right. Shelley said to skip hers. All right. So Elizabeth, Mike is wondering, what is the limit on a lease length? Can a landlord make a lease for 2 years?
I don't know if is there a 99-year limit on leases? Maybe there is. That's first year property, and so it's very fuzzy in my mind if there is some actual outer limit of a lease. There might be. 2 years is fine though, for sure. There's no law against it. It's not usually the landlord pushing for this, by the way. It's usually the tenant. Somebody wants to rent a single family home in a certain school district is the most common version of this story that we hear. I want to make sure my kid graduates and they've got 3 years left. So can I get a 3-year lease? And the landlord thinks, sure, let's go ahead and do a 3-year lease. No law stopping it. And like I said, it's usually tenant initiated, not landlord initiated.
All right. Donna was asking about safety and security. Apparently, it emailed us. I want to make sure it's also clear, like we're asking people to call and email us. We are also experiencing high volumes, and so it may take a week to get back to some folks. And I hate that, but it is just true. We're only capable of responding so fast to things. So apologize for the delay in any responses, Donna. So I don't have your specific question in front
Yeah.
of me. Um, But how much can a landlord charge in subsidized apartment for a security deposit?
Uh, actually, I mean, I don't think there's a set amount. Um, Mike, do you know?
Well, I know Minneapolis has a
Person,
ban on deposits over a month. There's some
over
ways
a
you can,
month.
yeah, there's some
Yeah.
ways to nudge it up just a bit, but generally there's no limit on security deposits is the
I mean,
basic rule.
there is a rule like federal like a subsidized housing programs tenants rights book. Um, and so maybe the specific program has a cap. We would need to know the specific program so we could look in the book
Yeah, there's not
to
a
see if there's a
blanket
cap. Yeah.
rule for all subsidies, that's for sure. And there's a lot of subsidies out there.
But yeah, the Minneapolis rule, what it says is like you can charge 1 month security deposit if you're going to charge additional money, then it can't be more than like double the rent, and the tenant has up to 3 months to pay it, whatever the amount is, assuming it's not like 6 months security deposit
So
type of stuff.
most, nah, maybe not most, but there are a lot of states that limit security deposits. There are caps on security deposits. And so it's a question we get fairly regularly. Minnesota just never adopted a cap on security deposits, a blanket one.
Yep. All right. I just put a link to where you can try and find a copy of what we call the Green Book. That's that giant tome of subsidy housing stuff. I'm also going to drop a link here in the chat to the Minneapolis ordinances, rental ordinances, so that if folks want to take a deeper dive in, they absolutely can. All right. Um, Anonymous is wondering, and there's a bunch going on here, so bear with us, but can a leasing manager impose inconsistent fees for the same thing? So if rent is due on the third, or rent is due on the first, but a late fee isn't assessed until the third, can the manager wait near 1 year before notifying me with threats of non-payment of fees?
Yeah. So first thought that goes here is the late fee statute in Minnesota, 504B 177, which limits late fees to 8% of whatever portion of the rent the tenant owes. But it also states that the late fee has to be written in the contract. And so it's got to be in your lease. There is no general law that says that the landlord has to wait until the third to impose a late fee. It could be on the second. I think the most common one we see is usually on the fifth, that if you pay by the fifth, there's no late fee. But I've seen the fourth, sixth, seventh, maybe the 10th even. And so that would be the starting point is what does the lease say? The second part of the question, or at least one of the second parts of the question, is what if the landlord doesn't enforce that for a long time if they don't actually chase a tenant for the late fees? Maybe they can still get, maybe they can actually get those. I think the hardest part for a landlord to chase a tenant for those kinds of fees is if the lease has renewed during that time. So if the tenant's lease was up in July and the landlord's trying to get late fees from last February, like 12 months ago, that's a tougher argument to me because they renewed the lease knowing or they should have known about the late fees having been incurred, and they still didn't assess them or insist on them before the new lease was agreed upon. So that's not exactly something that you'll find in a statute, but it's something that I think a judge would latch on to as a reason to say that's a separator where the landlord can't go back further than the last renewal.
Yep. All right. Fabulous. Um, okay. So if you have to pay a fee to pay your rent, is that part of rent?
It's not. Well, I guess it depends. It's
Classic lawyer answer.
I know. So if the fee is, say you're using, I hate using them, but it's what I had when I was a tenant. Rent Cafe, they charge a fee if you use your debit card or a credit card instead of linking it directly to your bank account. That fee is a convenience fee that goes to the payment processor. Um, you do have another option on how to pay it without the fee. Um, However, mandatory fees have to be disclosed on the lease. So if this is a fee that's consistent that the landlord is charging for processing your rent payment, the landlord, then that has to be disclosed and that would be part of rent.
Yeah, I think if there is a way to pay for free, then it would be kind of an optional fee, so the landlord wouldn't have had to disclose it. But if it's the only way to pay is a way that costs you money, then you're right. That it has to be not just disclosed in the lease, but disclosed in ads for the
That's right, in the
place.
ads.
Yeah.
Yeah, as part
And
of
there's
the
specific,
total amount due.
correct, there's specific language that would have to pop up on the ads and on the lease.
That law's only 13 months old, so it's still sort of being figured out by everybody.
Yep, and that's 504B.120, which I put in the chat. All right. Moving right along because we've got 5 minutes left and 7 questions. Paul is asking if rent is paid by money order, even if the renter has a copy receipt, is there any proof other than the hearsay if the landlord doesn't cash it?
So
So,
there's a
mhm.
law on money orders and cash. If a tenant pays with those by law, the landlord is required to give the tenant a receipt. That's what the law says. Now, landlords don't regularly do this. Routinely, they don't. But that's what the law says. And so the problem with the money order from the tenant's perspective is they have that little stub that's attached to the money order, which only proves the date that it was purchased and the amount that it was purchased for. We don't know who cashed it. And so a tenant paying with a money order, honestly, I don't recommend it unless they're doing it in person and the landlord gives them a signed receipt. I think they should treat it just like cash and not pay their rent unless they can prove the next day that they've paid it somehow. It can take 6 months to trace a money order to find out who cashed it.
All right. Gigi is wondering, are landlords required to replace carpeting in Minnesota? Their tenants often believe that carpeting should be replaced with each turnover.
So no, there's no law that says they're required to replace the carpet, not after each turnover. What applies here is 504B161, which is, you know, is it fit for its intended use and purpose? There can be very ugly carpeting from the 70s and the 80s who is still fit for its intended use and purposes, and the landlord doesn't have to replace it. I mean, that might be the law in another state, but it's not in Minnesota. There's no requirement that brand new carpet be installed.
All right, Fez, moving right along. All right. Anonymous, I believe this is a landlord. Are we required to pay interest on pet deposits?
Yeah, if you call it a deposit, you have to pay the interest, the 1% simple interest. So if the deposit is $500, the tenant's there a year, it's $5. If they're there 2 years, it's $10. But yes, if you call it a deposit, that implies that if the tenant performs something, which means returning the place in its original condition minus ordinary wear and tear, that they get the money back. And if that's the case, then yes, you have to pay interest on it as well.
All right. Okay. Oh, this was our landlord for the duck
Yeah.
issues. They're wondering, basically, if there's a health issue concern, should they get a doctor's note? Can they get a doctor's note?
So if you want to treat this as a reasonable accommodation, you need to create a form where the doctor explains why the dogs need to be cleaned, the ducks, not dogs. And there's requirements as to how much information you can request. I'm going to defer to our original answer as to, how you want to weight this. Sort of bringing in, trying to get a doctor to specifically say, yes, this is what's causing the health issues. It's not something you can do.
I mean, you can ask a doctor for that. They're going to say maybe it's causing it, but
Right.
I'd be hard pressed to find a doctor saying that is the cause of your health problems. Yeah.
I mean, I know, like, I have asthma. Cleaning ducts is something that I have to do annually because it does help. And so would that be a reasonable accommodation request that I would submit? Probably. And what they would get from a doctor is she has asthma. So this is beneficial to her condition.
Gotcha. All right, so we've got 3 questions left, but it is 1 minute to 3. Are you two able to stay on just a couple extra minutes so we can get
No,
through
20
these?
seconds, 20 seconds an answer. We'll be fine.
Well, I also want to point out, we've had a list of resources up on the screen for a little while here. But again, if you do have questions for us, feel free to give us a contact, either email or call, and we will get back to you as we are able. So thank you for that. All right, we're going to move along real quick. So Karen just wants to know, is it legal to have a blanket ban on renting to individuals who have a felony on their record? If they did do this, isn't that go against the FHA? Fair Housing Act is what FHA stands for.
Short answer is yeah. I think that the landlord can have a blanket ban on renting to people with a felony on their record. There have been lots of not decrees, but there have been statements from various levels of the government that have said that this shouldn't happen. But as far as a statute or a court case saying that that's the rule, that doesn't exist. Minneapolis does have something sort of limiting which felonies matter, but it's complicated. Minneapolis's ordinance gives landlords two options, either to use their own customized application process or the one that the city has created for them, and that limits it to a certain degree. But the short answer is there's not a law that stops this from happening.
All right. Yeah. I want to point out that felonies are not considered a protected class under any discrimination law. So, okay. Public housing manager here with a month-to-month lease. You mentioned lease renewals. I was wondering how giving a notice to a tenant for non-renewal would work with a month-to-month lease, and if it's possible rather than having to go through a court eviction. And this is actually our last question.
So if you're on a month-to-month lease, as the landlord, you're the public housing manager, you would give a notice to vacate. Make sure that you follow the proper notice requirements from the lease. And then if the tenant doesn't move out, then you can file for eviction for holdover.
Yeah, let me jump in because the public housing part is a key part of the question.
That's true.
Right. So that does have good cost protection. I mentioned Brooklyn Center earlier, but my earlier answer, which Alma's just kind of saying again in her own words, is about private market rentals. There are some subsidies where good cost protection does attach, and public housing is one of those. So in those situations, you would need good cause to have a non-renewal. I don't know if that's exactly what they're asking, but I mean, Alma's answer is right. I mean, you have to look at the lease to see how much notice is required, but there is good cause protection here.
That is correct. There needs to be a good reason for you not to want to renew the lease.
All right, and then I'm including statute 504B.135, which is a general statute that gives guidance on terminating a tenancy or a tenancy that doesn't have a set end date. So if the lease doesn't have anything different. Okay, that's it. We made it. Good job. 302. You all are fantastic. Thank you all so much that joined us here today and submitting all of your questions. These are really great conversations and questions to have. Again, if you've got anything specific or anything else that you want to follow up on, if you're a tenant, I do need to stress that while these webinars are open to anybody, our hotline is restricted to tenants. That's who we serve. And so if you are a tenant, you've got questions about your rights, please give us a call or send us an email. All that information is on the screen. Thank you so much again for everyone joining us. Mike, Amma, Matt, if you watch this recording, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day all, and we will see you next month. You take care now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye.